The night the Somali refugee disappeared, nothing felt urgent at first. There were no alarms, no flashing sirens, no frantic calls breaking the stillness. Just a quiet absence that slowly, painfully grew louder with each passing hour. He had arrived seeking safety. Like thousands before him, he crossed borders not for opportunity, not for ambition, but for survival. War had already taken enough from him. His homeland was fractured by violence, his future uncertain. In 2012, he believed he had finally reached a place where life could begin again. But instead, he vanished. At first, officials treated it as a routine case. Adults disappear all the time, they said. People move on. People leave without telling anyone. But this was different. This disappearance carried a weight that refused to stay buried. Something about it unsettled communities, ignited protests, and raised questions no one wanted to answer. He was a refugee. A word that already carries vulnerability. Already carries invisibility. And then he was gone. Friends noticed his absence before authorities did. He missed meetings. Missed calls. Missed moments he never would have ignored. His phone rang unanswered. His room remained untouched. The silence felt wrong. What made the case chilling wasn't just the disappearance itself, but the environment surrounding it. Surveillance gaps. Conflicting testimonies. Delayed responses. Institutional hesitation. Every step forward seemed met with resistance or delay. For the Somali community, this wasn't just one missing man. It felt like a message. A reminder of how easily lives like theirs could slip through cracks without consequence. Questions surfaced quickly. Was this a voluntary disappearance? Was there foul play? Was he targeted? Or was this a failure of a system meant to protect the most vulnerable? As days passed, concern turned into outrage. Vigils were held. Families spoke out. Community leaders demanded answers. Media attention grew, but clarity did not. What investigators initially dismissed as a simple missing persons case slowly revealed layers of complexity. Witness accounts didn't align. Timelines shifted. Official statements contradicted one another. And behind it all lingered an uncomfortable truth. When refugees disappear, their cases often don't receive the urgency they deserve. This was not just about one person anymore. It was about accountability. It was about silence. It was about whose lives are treated as searchable, and whose are quietly forgotten. By the time authorities realized the gravity of the situation, critical hours had already passed. And in missing person cases, time is everything. The question wasn't just where he went. The real question was, what allowed him to disappear so completely? And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this case would expose more than a missing man. It would expose systemic blind spots, social tension, and the uncomfortable reality of life at the margins. Because when someone disappears without a trace, the mystery doesn't begin with the vanishing. It begins with what came before it. And what failed afterward. In the days leading up to his disappearance, nothing about his behavior suggested he planned to vanish. He spoke with friends about the future. He asked questions about work permits, housing applications, and language classes. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of details people focus on when they believe tomorrow is coming. On the morning he was last seen, he followed his usual routine. He left his residence dressed simply. No luggage. No packed bags. No farewell messages. His documents remained behind, identification, refugee paperwork, personal belongings untouched. To investigators, this alone should have ruled out voluntary disappearance. In the months before his disappearance, he had begun to allow himself something rare among refugees who had fled conflict: routine without fear. Routine, for him, was not boring. It was proof of survival. He woke early, often before sunrise, a habit shaped by years of uncertainty. He preferred mornings because they felt predictable. Quiet. Safe. He attended language classes when available, practiced pronunciation alone at night, and asked endless questions about integration, not because he was impatient, but because he wanted to do things the right way. Friends described him as cautious but hopeful. Not withdrawn. Not reckless. He laughed easily in familiar company, especially when conversations drifted toward the future, work, stability, maybe even family one day. Those conversations mattered, because they contradicted one of the earliest assumptions investigators would later lean on. People planning to disappear do not plan a future. He had no known enemies. No debts. No involvement in criminal networks. His social circle was small but consistent, mostly fellow refugees navigating similar challenges. They relied on each other for emotional grounding, sharing stories of loss and survival that outsiders could not fully understand. Trauma shaped him, but it did not define him. What defined him was persistence. He had survived displacement, uncertainty, and loss. He had crossed borders not once, but multiple times. Each journey carried risk. Each decision required courage. By 2012, he believed the hardest part was behind him. That belief made what happened next even harder to accept. The day he disappeared was not marked by conflict. No arguments. No distress signals. No emotional rupture that would later make sense of his absence. He did not give away belongings or withdraw money. His financial records showed nothing unusual. Even his posture that day, recalled by witnesses, was ordinary. Upright. Purposeful. Calm. That normalcy would later haunt investigators. Because disappearances rooted in violence often leave emotional traces beforehand. Stress, fear, erratic behavior. His life showed none of that. Which meant if something happened, it happened externally, not internally. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. But it didn't. Instead, early assumptions crept in quietly. He was a refugee, they reasoned. Perhaps he moved on. Perhaps he relocated. Perhaps he didn't want to be found. Those assumptions would haunt the case. Witnesses later recalled seeing him that day, but their accounts never fully aligned. One said he appeared distracted. Another insisted he was calm, even hopeful. A third remembered him checking his phone repeatedly, as if waiting for a call that never came. The timeline began to fracture almost immediately. He was last confirmed at a specific location, a familiar place, not dangerous, not isolated. And then, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No camera footage. No digital trail. His phone went silent within hours, not powered down deliberately, but abruptly, as if removed from the network altogether. For investigators, that detail mattered. Phones die slowly. Networks fail sporadically. But silence like this is often sudden and intentional. Friends reported him missing within a short window. They knew his patterns. They knew his habits. They knew something was wrong. Yet the response was measured. Reserved. Delayed. Days passed before the case received focused attention. By then, opportunities had already slipped away. Surveillance cameras in the area had overwritten footage. Public transport records were incomplete. Witness memories faded. Each lost hour widened the gap between what could have been known and what was now speculation. Community leaders began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was there hesitation? Why wasn't the disappearance treated as high risk? Why did officials seem reluctant to escalate? Behind closed doors, tension grew. For the Somali refugee community, this was not unfamiliar territory. Many had experienced institutional neglect before, subtle, quiet, bureaucratic. Not cruelty in the open, but indifference behind paperwork. And indifference can be just as deadly. As the investigation slowly gathered momentum, inconsistencies surfaced. Statements changed. Reports conflicted. Officials disagreed on basic facts: when he was last seen, who spoke to him last, what direction he may have traveled. Each contradiction weakened trust. The family waited. Friends waited. A community waited. And in that waiting, fear grew, not just fear for him, but fear of what his disappearance represented. Because if someone could vanish this completely, this quietly, this easily, then anyone could. By the time law enforcement acknowledged the seriousness of the case, the narrative had already begun to slip from their control. The public wanted answers. Activists demanded transparency. Media outlets began asking what many were afraid to say aloud. Was this disappearance being mishandled? Or worse, ignored? As the days turned into weeks, one thing became clear: whatever happened to him did not happen in isolation. It unfolded inside a system riddled with blind spots, delays, and assumptions. And somewhere within those failures, the truth was buried. As the weeks stretched on with no answers, the investigation entered a dangerous phase, the phase where silence becomes policy. Officials released brief statements, carefully worded and emotionally empty. They confirmed that the man was still missing. They said there was no evidence of foul play. They asked the public for patience. But patience was running out. Within the Somali community, frustration turned into anger. Community leaders organized meetings. Elders spoke publicly. Young people took to the streets, holding signs with his name written in bold letters, demanding to know why a life could vanish without urgency. The question echoed everywhere. If this man were not a refugee, Would this case look different? Pressure mounted when journalists began digging deeper. What they uncovered was troubling. Key witnesses had not been formally interviewed until days after the disappearance. Initial reports were incomplete. Critical leads were logged late, or not at all. One journalist uncovered that a potential sighting, reported within 24 hours of the disappearance, had never been followed up. Another revealed that surveillance cameras near the last confirmed location were never secured in time. Each revelation chipped away at official credibility. Then came the contradiction that shook public confidence. Two separate agencies released timelines that did not match. One claimed the man was last seen in the early afternoon. The other placed his last confirmed presence hours later. Both insisted their version was accurate. Neither could explain the discrepancy. That gap, those missing hours, became the center of the mystery. Because disappearances don't happen in minutes. They happen in moments. In decisions. In encounters that go unnoticed until it's too late. As media coverage intensified, officials shifted tone. What was once a low-risk missing person was now labeled concerning. Task forces were mentioned. Reviews were promised. But for many, it felt reactive, not proactive. Too late. Activists accused authorities of systemic neglect. They argued that refugees often exist in a gray zone, visible enough to be counted, invisible enough to be forgotten. This case, they said, proved it. The nation began to listen. Talk shows debated responsibility. Human rights groups issued statements. Legal experts questioned whether protocol had been followed. The disappearance was no longer just about one man, it was about how society protects the most vulnerable. What transformed the disappearance from a local concern into a national reckoning was not a single revelation, but accumulation. At first, media coverage was restrained. Short segments. Brief mentions. A missing refugee. No confirmed foul play. The kind of story that flickers briefly before being replaced by something louder, more sensational. But something unusual happened. The story refused to fade. Journalists began receiving tips, not about sightings, but about process. About delays. About confusion. About a sense that something wasn't right in how the case was being handled. When reporters requested timelines, they received different versions depending on who they spoke to. That inconsistency became the story. One investigative piece questioned why the disappearance had not triggered an immediate high-risk response. Another examined how refugee cases were historically classified and compared closure rates with non-refugee missing persons. The data was uncomfortable. Public attention sharpened. Radio shows opened their lines. Callers spoke not just about the missing man, but about similar experiences, relatives who disappeared, reports filed late, cases that never escalated. Patterns began to emerge, and once patterns are recognized, they cannot be unseen. Social media accelerated everything. His photograph circulated widely. Hashtags appeared, demanding answers. Community members translated posts into multiple languages to reach broader audiences. What began as grief transformed into coordination. Protests followed. Not chaotic. Not violent. Organized. Purposeful. People gathered outside government buildings holding candles, photographs, and signs that asked simple questions with devastating clarity. Where is he? Why the delay? Would this be different if he wasn't a refugee? These questions landed hard. Officials attempted reassurance, but the tone no longer matched the moment. Statements about procedure and protocol felt hollow against lived experiences. Each attempt to calm the public seemed to confirm what many already believed, that the system was reacting, not leading. International attention followed. Human rights organizations referenced the case in reports addressing refugee protections. Legal observers questioned compliance with established standards. Foreign media outlets framed the disappearance as a test of national values. That framing mattered. Because once a case becomes symbolic, it stops belonging to those in charge of it. It belongs to the people. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified. Meetings multiplied. Communications teams rewrote statements. Investigators were urged to re-examine assumptions. But assumptions, once embedded, are difficult to extract. And then, in the middle of this rising scrutiny, the overlooked witness resurfaced. Their voice, once ignored, now carried weight. Not because it had changed, but because the environment had. Suddenly, what was once dismissed as uncertainty sounded like possibility. What was once sidelined now demanded attention. The system had not changed, the spotlight had. And under that spotlight, the cracks widened. Behind the scenes, investigators scrambled. Files were reopened. Interviews were repeated. But memories had already faded. Details blurred. What could have been clear in the first 48 hours was now speculation. And then came a development that shifted the entire case. A witness came forward. Not someone new, but someone who had spoken before, quietly, and been dismissed. This time, the witness insisted their account had been misunderstood. They described seeing the man in a situation that did not fit the official narrative. A place he was not supposed to be. With people he was not known to associate with. If true, it meant one thing. The investigation had been looking in the wrong direction. Authorities refused to confirm the details. They cited ongoing review. But the damage was done. Public trust had fractured. The case had crossed a line, from mishandled to potentially misrepresented. The nation watched closely now. Because when a disappearance exposes cracks this deep, the fear isn't just about what happened to one person. It's about what could happen again. And as the case moved forward, one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a mystery of where he went. It was a mystery of why the system failed him. The witness did not come forward dramatically. There was no press conference, no sudden revelation broadcast live on television. Instead, it happened quietly, almost reluctantly, the way truths often surface when fear and doubt have already done their damage. The witness had spoken once before, early on. Their statement had been brief, uncertain, and ultimately sidelined. At the time, investigators classified it as unreliable. Too vague. Too inconsistent. Not actionable. But now, weeks later, the witness returned with clarity. They described seeing the man on the day of his disappearance in a location that directly contradicted the official timeline. Not where authorities said he was last seen. Not moving in the direction they assumed. But somewhere else entirely, a place that raised immediate questions. More disturbing was who he was with. The witness recalled unfamiliar faces. Not friends. Not community members. People who did not fit into his known life. The interaction did not appear casual. There was tension. Brief words exchanged. A pause that lingered too long. Then they left together. If this account was accurate, it meant the disappearance was not random. It wasn't voluntary. And it wasn't simply a case of someone slipping through the cracks. It meant there was an encounter. And encounters leave traces, if they are followed in time. Investigators now faced a problem they could not easily explain away. Accepting the witness statement would require admitting that the early investigation had gone in the wrong direction. That critical hours had been wasted. That assumptions, quiet, unspoken assumptions, had guided decisions. So the response was cautious. Officials neither confirmed nor denied the new account. They described it as one of several leads under review. But behind closed doors, the tone had changed. The case was no longer being discussed as low risk. Internal reviews were triggered. Senior officers requested briefings. Too much scrutiny had arrived to ignore. Meanwhile, the community's grief hardened into resolve. Protests grew larger. Signs stopped asking questions and started making statements. Words like neglect, injustice, and silence appeared again and again. Family members spoke publicly for the first time. They described a man who had survived displacement, violence, and loss, only to disappear in a place that promised safety. They rejected the idea that he would vanish willingly. He had plans. He had hope. He had reasons to stay. And hope does not leave quietly. National attention intensified when legal advocates became involved. They questioned whether the refugee status of the missing man had influenced the pace and priority of the investigation. They demanded access to internal records. They called for independent oversight. The case was no longer just about finding a person. It was about accountability. Investigators began revisiting earlier decisions. Why was the initial report delayed? Why were certain areas never searched? Why were witnesses dismissed without follow-up? Each question peeled back another layer of discomfort. Then came the moment that shook confidence entirely. A document leaked. It revealed that concerns about the case had been raised internally within days of the disappearance, concerns that were never acted upon. Notes referenced uncertainty about classification. Discussions about workload. Debates over jurisdiction. In short, hesitation. Inside the institutions tasked with finding him, the case became something else entirely. Not a disappearance, but a liability. Internal communications later revealed a quiet struggle unfolding behind official statements. Investigators disagreed not only on direction, but on framing. Some pushed for escalation, arguing that the absence of evidence was itself evidence of urgency. Others urged restraint, warning against assumptions, against public pressure, against overreacting to what they still considered an ambiguous case. That disagreement stalled momentum. Files moved slowly between departments. Requests for additional resources were delayed by questions of jurisdiction. Responsibility blurred, passing hands without ever fully settling. Each unit waited for confirmation from another. Each delay justified by procedure. Procedure became the shield. What made this internal paralysis especially damaging was its invisibility. From the outside, the investigation appeared active. From the inside, it was fractured, constrained by hesitation, hierarchy, and fear of error. No one wanted to make the wrong call. And so, no one made the urgent one. Several investigators later admitted, off record, that the case made them uncomfortable in ways they struggled to articulate at the time. It crossed categories. It didn't fit cleanly into existing frameworks. Refugee status complicated jurisdiction. Lack of immediate evidence complicated escalation. Ambiguity ruled. In such environments, bias does not announce itself loudly. It operates quietly, disguised as caution. Disguised as neutrality. Disguised as professionalism. But neutrality, when misapplied, can be destructive. Critical early decisions were framed around what could not be proven rather than what could be prevented. Searches were limited by assumptions. Certain locations were deprioritized. Potential connections were dismissed as unlikely, not because they were disproven, but because they were inconvenient. Convenience shaped reality. When concerns were raised internally about these limitations, they were often deferred. We need more information. Let's wait. We don't have enough to justify that step yet. Waiting became habit. And habit became failure. As public scrutiny intensified, pressure within the system shifted from finding answers to managing optics. Communication strategies were revised. Language softened. Officials were instructed to avoid speculation, even internally. This created a chilling effect. Investigators who sensed something was wrong found themselves constrained, not by lack of belief, but by institutional gravity. The system moved slowly not because it didn't care, but because it was designed to avoid risk. Ironically, that avoidance became the greatest risk of all. The leaked document confirmed what many suspected, that early warnings had existed. That questions had been asked. That doubt had surfaced. And that action had stalled. It wasn't malicious. It was systemic. And systemic failures don't look dramatic in the moment. They look procedural, reasonable, defensible, until time passes. Until the missing remain missing. Until silence becomes permanent. The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Trust, once cracked, now splintered. Calls for resignations echoed. Officials promised transparency. Reviews were announced. But for many, it was already too late. Because transparency after delay feels like performance, not justice. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath protests, documents, statements, and speculation, one fact remained unchanged. He was still missing. No confirmed sightings. No physical evidence. No answers. Just a widening silence where a life once stood. As months passed without resolution, the investigation slowed, not officially, but in practice. Press briefings became less frequent. Updates grew shorter. Language shifted from urgency to endurance. The case was no longer described as active. It was described as open. That single word carried enormous weight. For the family, it meant waiting without direction. For the community, it meant learning to live with uncertainty. And for the nation, it meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. Some disappearances fade not because they are solved, but because attention moves on. Behind the scenes, the case file grew thicker but no clearer. Tips continued to arrive, most of them speculative. Sightings reported in distant cities were investigated and dismissed. Leads crossed borders and returned empty. Years after the disappearance, the absence of one man became a persistent shadow over the community. It was subtle at first, whispers at gatherings, questions exchanged quietly, a glance toward empty chairs where he should have sat today. But over time, the emptiness grew heavier. Parents spoke to their children differently. Elders spoke more cautiously. Daily routines carried an unspoken reminder. Someone who once moved freely among them had vanished, and no one could explain why. For his immediate family, life became an exercise in endurance. Every holiday, every gathering, every milestone carried a dual meaning, joy tempered by grief, celebration tempered by absence. They spoke of him in past tense when necessary, but often slipped into present tense, a habit of hope that refused to die. The younger generation of the community, those who had known him peripherally or only by reputation, internalized the disappearance differently. It became a cautionary tale. A story repeated not with horror, but with awareness. To move, to travel, to engage with officials, to trust systems, everything now carried a layer of caution they hadn't felt before. Counselors and social workers noted patterns of stress and anxiety, subtle but measurable. Refugees who arrived after him were taught caution, whom to trust, how to communicate, how to navigate official systems. Each lesson carried the weight of his absence. Community organizations changed the way they operated. Missing persons protocols were adapted. Outreach programs were designed with urgency, not simply guidance. Advocacy became active, not reactive. Where once the disappearance was a tragedy, it became a catalyst for procedural reform, small, structural changes aimed at preventing a repeat. Yet for all these changes, there was a collective sense of incompleteness. No amount of procedural improvement could replace the man who had vanished. No reform could answer the questions left behind. And the story, while symbolically powerful, remained unresolved. Psychologists later described a phenomenon familiar to those who experience prolonged ambiguity in traumatic loss, ambiguous loss. It's the grief that lingers without closure, without confirmation, without finality. The community, even decades later, exhibited its signs: hypervigilance, chronic stress, and a subtle wariness toward official systems meant to protect them. Every anniversary of his disappearance was marked quietly, often privately. Candles were lit. Photos displayed. Conversations revisited. And though these acts carried no legal resolution, they carried meaning. Memory became a form of resistance. Presence persisted in absence. What began as a local disappearance had expanded into a narrative of resilience. The community learned to speak, to advocate, and to hold systems accountable in ways that surpassed individual cases. His absence became a mirror, reflecting both institutional failure and the strength of those left behind. And perhaps most importantly, it taught that even when justice does not arrive, memory can endure. Even when the missing remain unseen, the impact is real. And even in silence, voices persist, demanding acknowledgement, remembrance, and respect. The man's name was still spoken at community gatherings. His photograph still appeared on posters, now faded by time. Candlelight vigils became annual rituals rather than urgent calls for action. Hope didn't disappear, it transformed. It became quieter, more fragile, less demanding. Legal reviews concluded that procedures had technically been followed, though improvements were recommended. Training programs were updated. Protocols rewritten. Officials acknowledged lessons learned. But lessons do not replace lives. For many in the refugee community, the case left a lasting imprint. It reinforced a fear already familiar, that safety is conditional and visibility is fragile. That even in places of refuge, justice can move unevenly. The disappearance became a reference point. A cautionary tale. A reminder whispered among families and friends. And yet, it also sparked change. Advocacy groups emerged stronger. Refugee support networks expanded. Media organizations became more vigilant in covering cases involving marginalized communities. The man's absence, painful as it was, forced conversations that had long been avoided. What happened to him remained unknown. But what his disappearance revealed became undeniable. It revealed how quickly assumptions can shape outcomes. How silence can be mistaken for consent. How systems designed to protect can fail when urgency is filtered through bias. For the family, there was no closure, only endurance. They continued to speak his name. Continued to ask questions. Continued to believe that somewhere, somehow, the truth still existed. And for those who followed the case closely, one realization lingered above all others. This mystery was never just about a vanishing. It was about whose disappearance demands action, and whose disappearance demands patience. Even after years, even after every headline faded and every procedure was updated, one truth remained: disappearance carries moral resonance far beyond the facts. It is not only the absence of a person. It is the presence of questions that refuse to settle. The weight of choices, those made and those not made, presses quietly on those left behind. In his disappearance, the community felt not just sorrow, but moral dislocation. They realized that systems, designed for safety, could falter silently. That oversight could be as destructive as intent. That humanity itself must often compensate where bureaucracy fails. Philosophers of justice argue that unresolved disappearances test the moral fabric of societies. They expose whose lives are prioritized, whose safety is assumed, and whose disappearance is normalized. In this case, the man's absence became a mirror, reflecting not only institutional lapses, but societal blind spots. What does it mean to vanish in plain sight? To slip from existence without proof of harm, yet with every indicator that something went wrong? The community wrestled with these questions. Parents asked how they could protect their children in a world where disappearance could happen so quietly. Youth wondered how to navigate a society that would sometimes see them only as statistics. Leaders considered what accountability truly meant when prevention is inconsistent. And yet, within the philosophical weight of absence, there was also clarity. The case illuminated resilience, moral responsibility, and the necessity of vigilance. While no one could return him, his disappearance demanded something in return: awareness, action, and memory. Humanity, in this case, became both witness and participant. Witness to failure, participant in accountability. Witness to absence, participant in remembrance. The lessons, if learned, would extend far beyond borders, systems, or immediate grief. They would embed themselves in policy, in advocacy, and in the daily awareness of a community forever changed. This understanding reframed the disappearance. No longer only a story of loss, it became a story of ethical weight. A call to recognize the unseen, to prioritize the overlooked, to acknowledge that every life matters, even when it vanishes. And in that reframing, something remarkable emerged. The man's story, though unresolved, had power. It had become a voice in absentia, demanding attention, vigilance, and humanity from everyone who would listen. Years after the disappearance, the silence still spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. It lived in unanswered questions, in files revisited without progress, in the quiet way officials referenced the case in past tense without ever saying it was over. The man remained officially missing, but unofficially, he had become something else, a symbol. A symbol of absence. Justice, in this case, never arrived wearing clarity. There was no arrest, no courtroom resolution, no final report that neatly tied the story together. Instead, justice took on a different form, imperfect, incomplete, but meaningful in its own way. It lived in memory. The man's name continued to surface whenever discussions turned to refugee protection, investigative bias, or institutional accountability. His disappearance became a point of reference, not because it was solved, but because it demanded not to be forgotten. And forgetting is the final injustice. For the family, life moved forward because it had to. Days passed. Seasons changed. But time never replaced answers. There was no moment of acceptance, only adaptation. The kind that comes from carrying grief quietly, without resolution. They learned to live with not knowing. Communities learned something else. They learned that visibility matters. That urgency must be demanded, not assumed. That silence, when left unchallenged, becomes policy. The disappearance reshaped how cases involving refugees were discussed, reported, and sometimes handled. Not enough to undo the past, but enough to change the future. Investigators, years later, acknowledged what could not be said early on, that assumptions played a role. That delays mattered. That the absence of immediate urgency shaped outcomes in ways no one could reverse. And that realization carried weight. Because this case was never about one moment. It was about a sequence of choices. Small decisions. Quiet delays. Missed opportunities. Each one insignificant on its own, devastating when combined. Some mysteries end with answers. Others end with responsibility. This one ended with reflection. The man did not disappear from history. He disappeared into it. His story now lives wherever questions are asked about who is protected, who is believed, and who is pursued when they vanish. And that is the final truth. Mysteries are not always solved. But they always leave something behind. A lesson. A warning. A voice. Every mystery leaves behind a voice. Not always heard. Not always answered. But present. And in this case, we listened.